Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of the Archival Discourses. On today's stream, I'm very lucky to be rejoined by Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly. How are you, Todd?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here.
And today we're going to be discussing someone who we've discussed previously. Last summer we did a stream on Scipio Africanus, and one of the main historical authors on the life of Africanus is the Greek author Polybius, and today me and Todd are going to be discussing his ideas on political constitutions, in particular the Roman constitution, which can be found in book 6 of his histories. Why don't you, for the benefit of the audience, Todd, give a little more information on who Polybius was?
Right. So Polybius was a Greek nobleman, historian from the city of Megalopolis. He was taken as a hostage by the Roman state and was very close friends to the Scipii family. Now, many people suspect that leads to him having biased reporting. But what I think is interesting is what we might call in historical terms the embarrassment principle, right? You wouldn't report something that makes your side look bad. Polybius is one of the most fair-minded Greco-Roman historians of the Carthaginians, which if he was just a patsy or lackey for the Scipii, you might not think he'd do that because Carthage and Hannibal was the great enemy of Scipio Africanus. So I think in that regard, it's probably not fair to say that he had a slanted bias. In fact, in his own in the introduction or in the first book of his histories, he mentions that a historian ought to be loyal to the truth first and foremost. So even if that means saying something poorly about a friend, if your friend actually did that thing, and then saying something well of an enemy if your enemy did that noble thing. And in that regard, it sounds almost proto-Christian, the idea that you should have a higher commitment to the truth, not just to your friends, and you should speak the truth even if it makes your friends look bad and your enemies look good, which I think goes to the credit of Polybius as an author and adds to his credibility greatly. But also, in addition to writing history, he also analyzes different political forms of government. And this isn't the only section in which he does it, but this chapter, book 6, though, is where he really takes a deep dive into this.
I should say the main reason I was interested in doing this stream today is Polybius, in the book 6 of his histories, he has this concept called Anacyclosis, which is kind of his contribution to what we know as cyclical history, the idea of the rise and fall of empires and civilizations. And what really got me into this topic was A.A. Academic Agent. In his book, The Prophets of Doom, he published a couple of years ago, though he talks about people like Spengler and Toynbee and Julius Evola. He has an introductory section where he goes into the sort of origins of cyclical history. And he talks about Polybius because Polybius is really one of the first authors to really talk about, the cycle of history. And there's also a very unique angle to Polybius's Anacyclosis because he's largely looking at the cycle of political governments and political constitutions, where a lot of the other thinkers like Spengler and Toynbee are being very macro. They're really focusing on, wider aspects of civilization such as art, culture, warfare, and the media, and culture, etc. Whereas Polybius is really talking about, the political nature of states. And so what's really fascinating is that Polybius, what he's doing is he's kind of building on top of Aristotle, because Aristotle in his Politics laid out 3 different forms of government. You've essentially got a monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But what you have ultimately is there's 3 like corrupted versions of these. So you have monarchy or kingship becomes tyranny, aristocracy becomes oligarchy, and democracy becomes ochlocracy or mob rule. And what Polybius is doing is saying that ultimately in history, you go through this cycle where you start out as a monarchy, a kingship, you then become a tyranny, you then become an oligarchy, then you go to so you go to aristocracy, then oligarchy, then you revert to democracy, then you subvert to mob rule, and then you repeat the whole cycle again and go right back to monarchy. And one of his Polybius's most interesting insights is you obviously mentioned there, Todd, that he was taken as a hostage to Rome is Polybius very much becomes one of the great sort of historians of the sort of mid-Roman Republic, Rome at the time of her great sort of conquests, the Punic Wars and the wars of the Macedonians and the Greeks, and I think it would be an understatement to say that he was kind of a bit wild, had a bit of a wonder factor when it came to Rome, because he ultimately believed that Rome had broken the cycle of Anacyclosis, and that the Roman Republic was the perfect political government which could buck the trend of history. Is there anything you want to add to that summation at all?
Yes. So you are correct in bringing in Aristotle, because he kind of gives us the linguistic schema that allows us to talk in these terms. But also a brief reference to Plato's Republic, books 7, 8, and 9, where he describes really the first, at least in the written Western account, of how a government falls. Not necessarily a cycle, because he doesn't want to talk about how it restarts. So he's already laid out in his description of the ideal city-state, because it describes in his idea the ideal state of the soul, the rule of the philosopher kings, which will then devolve into seeking honor, clout seeking in modern day terms, which will lead to a democracy, the rule of the warriors. And then as they gain wealth by their force of arms, they then lean on the wealth more than their honor and force of arms and become an oligarchy. And then when an oligarchy, when people become wealthy, they then assume that wealth is a natural state of things and then desire it to just be given to them for free. In fact, he has a section about how the children of oligarchs become Democrats, and it sounds a lot like boomers. So it's an old trend. And then once the boomers start, voting money around, the tyrants then step in and say, well, let's just, expedite the exchange. If you vote for me, I'll make sure you get the money when it's transferred. And so Plato's really the first guy that talks about, now the idea of the philosopher kings is entirely fictitious. He's intentionally making up a new ideal form of government. But from that falling down, the other forms were recorded throughout history. And so he sort of begins this process of describing decline. I think before Plato, we don't really have, the concept of decline exists, obviously, in like Egyptian, Greek, and Hebrew texts, but the idea of like describing it in a sort of like scientific detail, I think, begins with Plato.
Oh, no, well, thank you for that. And what I would like to do is I've got a website up which has got the whole of Book 6. And what I'd like to do is read through segments of Book 6 to sort of further hash out these ideas of Polybius's. One thing I will note for the benefit of our audience is that Book 6, though it's got all of this stuff on political constitutions in there, in the middle of it, Polybius goes on this digression about the Roman army, which is very fascinating and very, very detailed. However, it's very tangential to our discussion, so we will not be discussing those segments because they make up about half of the book, and the stream will never end if we cover that as well. So I'm just going to bring up my page. Okay. Let's zoom in a bit so that's a bit more readable. Is that fairly readable, Todd?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Okay. So, preface, political constitutions. I'm aware that some will be at a loss to account for my interrupting the course of my narrative for the sake of entering upon the following disquisition on the Roman constitution. Yes, because the first 5 books, Polybius is going through, I believe it's the Punic War up until the Battle of Cannae, and then some of the other events in the Hellenistic world, and then he's kind of going on a tangent by doing this, interestingly enough. But I think that I've already in many passages made it fully evident that this particular branch of my work was one of the necessities imposed on me by the nature of my original design. I pointed this out with special clearness in the preface, which explained the scope of my history. I there stated that the feature of my work, which was at once the best in itself and the most instructive to the students of it, was that it would enable them to know and fully realize in what manner and under what kind of constitution it came about that nearly the whole world fell under the power of Rome in somewhat less than 53 years, an event certainly without precedent. This being my settled purpose, I could see no more fitting period than the present for making a pause and examining the truth of the remarks about to be made on this constitution. In private life, if you wish to satisfy yourself as to the badness or goodness of particular persons, you are not, if you wish to get a genuine test, examine their conduct at a time of uneventful repose, but in the hour of brilliant success or conspicuous reverse. For the true test of a perfect man is the power of bearing, the spirit and dignity, violent changes of fortune. An examination of constitution should be conducted in the same way, and therefore being unable to find in our day a more rapid or more signal change than that which has happened to Rome, I reserved my disquisition on its constitution for this place. What is really educational and beneficial to students of history is the clear view of the causes of events and the consequent power of choosing the better policy in a particular case. Now, in every practical undertaking by states, we must regard as the most powerful agent for success or failure the form of its constitution. Far from this, as far from a fountainhead of conceptions and plans of action, not only proceed but attain their consummation. So, again, he's sort of just giving a broad introduction to what he's going to be arguing in this book. You know, how did Rome end up dominating, you know, pretty much the whole civilized world in this half a century? And that's just some fragments. So, classification of constitutions. Of the Greek republics, which have again and again risen to greatness and fallen into insignificance, it is not difficult to speak whether we recount their past history or venture an opinion on their future. For to report what is already known is an easy task, nor is it hard to guess what is to come from our knowledge of what has been. But in regard to the Romans, it is neither an easy matter to describe their present state, owing to their complexity of their constitution, nor to speak with confidence of their future, from our inadequate acquaintance with the peculiar institutions in the past, whether affecting their public or their private life. It will require then no ordinary attention and study to get a clear and comprehensive conception of the distinctive features of this constitution. Now, it is undoubtedly the case that most of those who profess to give us authoritative instruction on this subject distinguish three kinds of constitutions, which they designate kingship, aristocracy, democracy. But in my opinion, the question might fairly be put to them whether they name these as being the only ones or as the best. In either case, I think they are wrong, for it is plain that we must regard as the best constitution that which partakes of all these three elements. And this is no mere assertion, but has been proved by the example of Lycurgus, who was the first to construct a constitution at Sparta on this principle. Nor can we admit that these are the only forms, for we have had before now examples of absolute and tyrannical forms of government, which, while differing as widely as possible from kingship, yet appear to have some points of resemblance to it, on which account all absolute rulers falsely assume and use, as far as they can, the title of king. Again, there have been many instances of oligarchical governments having in appearance some analogy to aristocracies, which are, if I may say so, as different from them as it is possible to be. The same also holds good about democracy. And just to jump off on this point about Sparta and Lycurgus creating the first sort of constitution that combined, you know, kingship, aristocracy, and democracy. Well, it's very interesting some of the comparisons you can even draw between Sparta and Rome, who was this other state that was able to combine all three of these things. But Sparta had a monarchy, but it had two kings, again, to counter-check each other. They have a senate. I'm blanking on the name. Isn't it called the Perusium, the Spartan Senate, Todd?
Well, do you mean the elders, the Gerousia?
Oh, Gerousia, sorry. Yeah, that's what I was going to get muddled up with.
Yeah, because in Greek, Senate is Gerousia.
Ah, well, thank you. And also, they also have the ephors, who are this sort of elder council as well above the Senate. These sort of council of wise religious men, and then of course you have the concept of citizenship and your Spartan homai, and just very interesting that the Romans also, like the Spartans, insist on having two executives. They have two consuls as opposed to two kings. I have to wonder if they were deliberately modelling Sparta. Do you have anything to elaborate on that? Or,
well, see, that's an interesting observation. There have been other historians and other individuals who've observed that Sparta, I think Machiavelli, for one, observes that Rome has had two executives. I'm not sure if that was directly inspired by Sparta, because many of the particular elements of the Roman political system, the Roman Republic is founded in 509 BC with the overthrow of Tarquin. And while at that time Sparta did exist as a mixed government of sorts, this is even before the Persian invasion of Xerxes. So the question is how much contact did the Romans have with that? I know Sparta had some colonies in Italy. I think one of them was Tarentum. So it is conceivable. I wouldn't say it's not possible. But I'm not aware of any direct connection, and nor am I aware of any ancient historian who claims there is one.
But it's also interesting, isn't it, that the Roman consuls obviously had the power of imperium or imperator to command Roman armies in the field as the Spartan kings did. So that's another comparison. And it's also interesting, isn't it, that the two states in the classical world that mix all three of these elements were also some of the most militaristic.
Yes, the other interesting thing is that the difference with Rome was that the consul was elected every year. Now, I think it was the first Samnite War, Livy states that the office of proconsul was developed because it would be rather inconvenient to recall a consul leading a field army in a campaign when his year term went up. So if he was actually on campaign, there would be a special extension given. But this was an elected official rather than a hereditary official. And what's interesting is Sparta would punish their kings with exile. So, for example, we have Demaratus, who was an exiled king of Sparta in the court of King Xerxes during the invasion of Greece. But in Rome, well, I think ultimately after the Tarquins were overthrown, Rome had an overall aversion to hereditary rule. That is until Augustus, centuries later. But even then, Augustus called himself first citizen, not king. Right? That name was hated because of the Tarquin. So, but that's your other point about the militaristic element. That is interesting. And that, they now Rome didn't have a soldier caste. Sparta did. The homoioi were actually a caste of soldiers. At their peak, they had about 10,000 citizens. And then there was the craftsmen, the perioikoi, who were free, not slave, but they weren't soldiers. They were craftsmen making weapons and tools. The Romans, their military was based on a sort of militia service system. So if you were involved in the political system of the Roman state, then you were required to serve militarily, much like most of the other Greek city-states. So there are some differences, i.e. the Roman military wasn't caste-based like the homoioi, and the consuls were elected, not hereditary.
No, those are fair points. Thank you for bringing those up. So, actually, the rotation of polities. So, I will illustrate the truth of what I say. We cannot hold every absolute government to be a kingship, but only that which is accepted voluntarily and is directed by an appeal to reason rather than to fear and force. Nor again is every oligarchy to be regarded as an aristocracy. The latter exists only where the power is wielded by the justest and wisest men, selected on their merits. Similarly, it is not enough to constitute a democracy that the whole crowd of citizens should have the right to do whatever they wish or propose, but where reverence to the gods, succour of parents, respect to elders, obedience to laws are traditional and habitual in such communities. If the will of the majority prevail, we may speak of the form of government as a democracy. So then we enumerate 6 forms of government, the 3 commonly spoken of which I have just mentioned, and 3 more allied forms. I mean despotism, oligarchy, and mob rule. The first of these arises without artificial aid and in the natural order of events. Next to this, and produced from it by the aid of art and adjustment, comes kingship, which degenerating into the evil form allied to it, by which I mean tyranny. Both are once more destroyed and aristocracy produced, again, the latter being in the course of nature perverted to oligarchy, and the people passionately avenging the unjust acts of their rulers. Democracy comes into existence, which again, by its violence and contempt of law, becomes sheer mob rule. No clearer proof of the truth of what I say could be obtained than by a careful observation of the natural origin, genesis, and decadence of these several forms of government, for it is only by seeing distinctly how each of them is produced that a distinct view can also be obtained of its growth, zenith, and decadence, and the time, circumstance, and place in which each of these may be expected to recur. This method I have assumed to be especially applicable to the Roman constitution, because its origin and growth have from the first followed natural causes. And just to sort of talk about this idea of Roman kingship, of course, the Roman monarchy began with Romulus and Remus, with Romulus slaying Remus and becoming the sole king of Rome. And was also interesting because you talk about this idea of the Spartan kings being exiled. Well, doesn't that happen to Romulus? Isn't he exiled towards the end of his life anyway?
I don't remember how Romulus ends.
Okay, I just remember reading Plutarch's Life of Romulus, and I'm pretty sure Romulus is forced into exile. So just thought it was an interesting comparison. But well, when you're looking at kingship, especially in this Polybian or even Aristotelian form, it's this idea of the just ruler, and I think it's more Romulus' successor, Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome. He's the one who really brings in a lot of the traditional sort of laws and the religious services and of the early Roman monarchy and kingship. So so Numa is, I think, a very strong example of that, and we can see that how we go from Numa all the way down to Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome before its deposition, how that degenerates. So so far so good. Next we have the origin of constitutions. Now, the natural laws which regulate the merging of one form of government into another are perhaps best discussed with greater accuracy by Plato and some other philosophers, but their treatment from its intricacy and exhaustiveness is only within the capacity of a few. I will therefore endeavour to give a summary of the subject, just so far as I suppose it to fall within the scope of a practical history and the intelligence of ordinary people. For if my exposition appear in any way inadequate, owing to the general terms in which it is expressed, the details contained in what is immediately to follow will amply atone for what is left for the present unsolved. What is the origin then of the constitution, and whence is it produced? Suppose that from floods, pestilences, failure of crops, or some such causes the race of man is reduced almost to extinction. Such things we are told have happened, and it is reasonable to think will happen again. Suppose accordingly all knowledge of social habits and arts to have been lost. Suppose that from the survivors, as from seeds, the race of man to have again multiplied. In that case, I presume they would, like the animals, herd together, for it is but reasonable to suppose that bodily weakness would induce them to seek those of their own kind to be herd with. And in that case, too, as with animals, he who was superior to the rest in strength of body or courage of soul would lead and rule them. For what we see happen in the case of animals that are without the faculty of reason, such as bulls, goats, and cocks, among them there can be no dispute that the strongest take the lead. And we must regard as in the truest sense the teaching of nature. Originally, then, it is probable that the condition of life among men was this: herding together like animals and following the strongest and bravest as leaders. The limit of this authority would be physical strength, and the name we should give it would be despotism. But as soon as the idea of family ties and social relation has arisen amongst such agglomerations of men, then is born also the idea of kingship, and then for the first time mankind conceives the notion of goodness, justice, and reverse. I mean, I find this idea interesting, the idea that human political organization is not too dissimilar from a pack of animals, and I think some interesting implications he's drawing there. It's I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that humans by their nature need organization and direction, like any group of animals would. So is any sort of commentary you want to make on that at all? Or?
Well, it's interesting that at this time, and then even earlier, the historian Thucydides and Polybius tend to take a more, what we might call, naturalistic approach to history, because where there's a lot of, for example, Plutarch will more or less, give the gods their due. Like, he has the life of Theseus in his Noble Lives, which is considered by many to be a mythological character, as is Romulus. But of course, at the time, Greeks and Romans both considered them to be their real people, progenitors of Athens and Rome, respectively. And he will talk about divine intervention and gods acting in places. See, what's interesting here is he's saying that, no, governments arise out of naturalistic causes. Right? So, for example, oftentimes you might have a priest caste that would say, oh, the gods told me to do this. Numa is a good example. You mentioned Numa, right? He claims, as a follower of the Pythagorean doctrine in the Life of Numa by Plutarch, to have had contact with these divine beings who told them how to organize the religious worship. And so it's interesting that some of the Greek and Roman historians will be like, yeah, there's these active divine agents in the world, whatever you want to call them, gods, daimons, or spirits, whereas Thucydides and Polybius tend to give a much more naturalistic account that we're not going to make reference to these beings. Now, they're being very careful. They're not saying they don't exist. They're just saying that in our explanation of history, we're not going to refer to them, which I think is interesting. Maybe they learned their lesson from Socrates.
Perhaps. Okay, and next we have how kingship turns into tyranny. This then is a natural process of formation among the mankind of the notion of goodness and justice and their opposites. And this is the origin and genesis of genuine kingship. For people do not only keep up the government of such men personally, but for their descendants also for many generations, from the conviction that those who are born from and educated by men of this kind will have principles also like theirs. But if they subsequently become displeased with their descendants, they do not any longer decide their choice of rulers and kings by their physical strength or brute courage, but by the differences of their intellectual and reasoning faculties. From practical experience of their decisive importance of such a distinction. In old times, then, those who were once thus selected and obtained this office grew old in their royal functions, making magnificent strongholds and surrounding them with walls and extending their frontiers, partly for the security of their subjects and partly to provide them with abundance of the necessities of life. And while engaged in these works, they were exempt from all vituperation or jealousy, because they did not make their distinctive dress, food, or drink at all conspicuous, but lived very much like the rest, enjoyed in the everyday employment of the common people. But when their royal power became hereditary in their family, and they found every necessary for security ready to their hands, as well as more than was necessary for their personal support, then they gave the rein to their appetites, imagined that rulers must needs wear different clothes from those of subjects, have different and elaborate luxuries at the table, and must even seek sensual indulgence, however unlawful the source, without fear or denial. These things having given rise in the one case to jealousy and offence, in the other to outburst of hatred and passionate resentment, the kingship became a tyranny. The first step in disintegration was taken, and the plots began to be formed against the government, which did not now proceed from the worst men, but from the noblest, most high-minded, and most courageous, because these are the men who can least submit to the tyrannical acts of their rulers. Again, I think it's interesting that Polybius ultimately, that with monarchy or kingship, the idea of a single executive ruler isn't the problem. It's more, I think, the idea of hereditary succession, that the later kings feel entitled to rule. It's almost like they don't have the proper skills or talents to govern effectively, and they don't have any sort of noblesse oblige to their citizens or subjects that they're supposed to rule over. I mean, would you say that's a fair assessment, or?
Yeah. So there's a couple things here. The idea that early on this war band mentality is there's not a lot of class hierarchy because there's not a lot of wealth distinction. Much later in history, the Byzantine historian diplomat Priscus writes in the court of Attila that Attila lived like that. He didn't have any of these heirs or anything. He drank out of a wooden cup, ate out of a wooden bowl. But these nomadic peoples who then became indulgent, like the later Mongols, their empire fell apart because of that, because it ruined their warrior virtues, if you will. But also it inspires envy and resentment. They're like, well, why should you have all this when we're a part of the war band too, or we're a part of the kinship group too? And so, and remember what you read last time. He said that in his I guess you could say state of nature, if we're going to go full Rousseau Locke here, in his version of the state of nature, what happens is the bravest and the strongest, by proof of their bravery and strength, become leaders. They have to prove that to the other members of the war band. Once it just becomes hereditary and they just keep gobbling up all the money, it becomes clear to everybody that these people aren't the people who are holding this office are not worthy of it, because they didn't achieve it in the way that their forefathers did.
No, certainly not. No. Next, we have the degeneration of constitutions. But as soon as the people got leaders, they cooperated with them against the dynasty for the reasons I have mentioned. And then kingship and despotism were alike entirely abolished, and aristocracy once more began to revive and start afresh. From their immediate gratitude to those who had deposed the despots, the people employed them as leaders and entrusted their interests to them, who, looking upon this charge at first as a great privilege, made the public advantage their chief concern, and conducted all kinds of business, public or private, with diligence and caution. But when the sons of these men received the same position of authority from their fathers, having had no experience of misfortunes, and none at all of civil equality and freedom of speech, but having been bred up from the first under the shadow of their father's authority and lofty position, some of them gave themselves up with passion to avarice and unscrupulous love of money, others to drinking and the boundless debaucheries which accompanies it, and others to the violation of women or the forcible appropriation of boys. And so they turned an aristocracy into an oligarchy. But it was not long before they roused in the minds of their people the same feelings as before, and their fall therefore was very like the disaster which befell the tyrant. So with the degeneration from aristocracy to oligarchy, it's almost like the aristocracy is just a series of small kings, shall we say, like a club of kings who rule collectively. And the same thing happens because they inherit their position from their fathers. these later elites degenerate and again just become debauched and depraved, and again have no sense of noblesse or oblige or idea of justice in the governing of the state. So, and what I find really interesting is my mind can't help but go to the present state of our regime in the West, Todd, amongst the various democratic oligarchs in the various Western countries.
Oh yeah, yeah. They're clearly old blue bloods, but they don't have any sort of connection with the people that they rule over.
No, certainly not. And okay. Next we've got how democracy arises and degenerates. For no sooner had the knowledge of the jealousy and hatred existing in the citizens against them emboldened someone to oppose the government by word or deed, than he was sure to find the whole people ready and prepared to take his side. Having then got rid of these rulers by assassination or exile, they do not venture to set up a king again, being still in the terror of the injustice to which this led before, nor dare they entrust a common interest again to more than one, considering the recent example of their misconduct, and therefore, as the only sound hope left them is that which depends upon themselves, they are driven to take refuge in that, and so changed the constitution from an oligarchy to a democracy, and took upon themselves the superintendence and charge of the state. And as long as any survive who have had experience of oligarchical supremacy and domination, they regard their present constitution as a blessing, and hold equality and freedom as of the utmost value. But as soon as a new generation has arisen and the democracy has descended to their children's children, long association weakens their value for equality and freedom, and some seek to become more powerful than the ordinary citizens, and the most liable to this temptation are the rich. So when they begin to be fond of office and find themselves unable to obtain it by their own unassisted efforts and their own merits, they ruin their estates while enticing and corrupting the common people in every possible way. By which means, when, in their senseless mania for reputation, they have made the populace ready and greedy to receive bribes, the virtue of democracy is destroyed, and it is transformed into a government of violence and the strong hand. For the mob, habituated to feed at the expense of others, to have its hopes of a livelihood in the property of its neighbours, as soon as it has got a leader sufficiently ambitious and daring, being excluded by poverty from the sweets of civil honours, produces a reign of mere violence. Then come tumultuous assemblies, massacres, banishments, redivisions of land, until, after losing all trace of civilization, it has once more found a master and a despot. This is the regular cycle of constitutional revolutions, and the natural order in which constitutions change, are transformed, and return again to their original stage. If a man have a clear grasp of these principles, he may perhaps make a mistake as to the date at which this or that will happen to a particular constitution, but he will rarely be entirely mistaken as to the stage of growth or decay at which it has arrived, or as to the point at which it will undergo some revolutionary change. However, it is in the case of the Roman constitution that this method of inquiry will most fully teach us its formation, its growth, and its zenith, as well as the changes awaiting it in the future. For this, if any constitution ever did, owed, as I said just now, its original foundation and growth to natural causes, and to natural causes will owe its decay. My subsequent narrative will be the best illustration of what I say. And I find interesting this aspect of the with democracy, it's not a decline of the hereditary kings or decline of the elite. It's the decline of the citizens. The citizens no longer care about their fellow man, or having a just and good society. All sorts of retreats into petty squabbles and their own selfish interests. And I don't think this is entirely wrong, but I will say, out of all of the model laid out here by Polybius, I find his model of democracy in the system a bit flawed, because if you want my view, especially if we're looking at history, yes, I would agree we can see kingship then become degenerating to tyranny, then becoming aristocracy, then degenerating to oligarchy. I think when it comes to democracy, though, again, he's conceiving of it as the rule of the people, as the word democracy means, demos and kratos, the power of the people. In reality, as you or I know, Todd, what really happens in a kind of what you might call a true democracy, mass populism, if you will, is really you have the rise of a Caesar figure, a man of the people, who rules in the interest of the people rather than necessarily the citizens governing themselves, because again, I don't believe that's really possible unless it's on a very small and local scale. And So fundamentally, I mean, we can even see this today because I spoke earlier about the our current leaders are like this decrepit oligarchy. But if we're looking at something like America with Trump and MAGA, again, you can almost say MAGA is the true representation of what it is to be a democracy. It's this sort of mass populist movement, and it has its strongman leader in someone like Donald Trump. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, so there's a few things. I want to touch on Polybius first here. In each of the three pairings of degeneration, it's always with the increasing wealth of the virtuous form corrupting it so that it falls into the lower form. So it's the easy access to wealth that, based on the strength of the virtuous form, it generates, which then leads to degeneration as people then seek their own personal and private interests. Now, and second of all, this sort of brutal war of massacres and repressions. Polybius didn't live to see this, but in the late Roman Republic, you had Marius and Sulla, Caesar and Pompey, and Octavius and Anthony, and we saw all of these things happen that he was afraid of. Now, with regards to the democracy, to your point, I mean, Athens didn't have a Caesar figure. Athens fell in the Peloponnesian War, but then after the 30 tyrants were expelled, democracy was restored and sort of existed as a vassal state of Macedon after Philip's conquest. And the other thing too is what are we constituting as democracy? Because if we look at the ancient Slavic tribes, as recorded by Polybius in Book 7 of his Wars, History of the Wars, he says that they lived under an ancient democracy where no one man ruled them, and that in his own day, so he's writing in the 6th century AD, this was an ancient custom. And so, hypothetically, the medieval Russian Vetch, which was a popular assembly, which continued in some sort of truncated form down until Tsarist times, was probably rooted in this ancient tradition that Procopius talks about. And it would seem under those conditions that, at least up until the Golden Horde, Russia didn't have these autocratic institutions. And a, quote, democratic process existed for over 1,000 years.
Thank you. I will just come back regarding Athens. I mean, if you're thinking about, a kind of a populist leader, I mean, Pericles, I think, is the closest Athens really gets to a Caesar figure, though in fairness, he never takes any of the more extreme moves that Caesar would take, I think, or even Augustus would take. Though I certainly, to me, I think Pericles really represents that. He rules Athens at a time when it's most democratic. I mean, would you not say that's a fair point?
Well, I think the more likely Caesar figure is Alcibiades, but he gets exiled precisely because of his political ambitions. Because he does, I think, illustrate Caesar potential. But again, his career was very eclectic, and he was exiled from Athens. Then he comes back in to help them fight the Spartans a little bit, and then I guess he dies. But the Athenian, it's hard to talk about Athenian democracy because when Western historians talk about ancient Greece, they usually stop with Alexander, and then they go to Rome, because I guess that makes sense. But if you read like Polybius and Xenophon and Plutarch, they carry Greek history right up until the Roman conquest. And these independent city-states are still existing and fighting each other. And Athens still exists until it's incorporated into the Roman state. But very little is written about Athens. So it's hard to piece together what form of government it would have had. By the time of the Roman conquest, it was a part of the Achaean League, which is itself a form of self-government. The Founding Fathers and the Federalist Papers write about it. So I don't think Athens ever truly gave up its representative system. And then when the Romans annexed Greece, they were still a republic. So I don't see any discontinuity until at least Augustus.
Well, in preparation for the stream, you sent me a video of this, some sort of professor talking about Polybius and Anacyclosis, and he had a pretty interesting analysis of the cycle with Athens, because he said, you have ancient Athens, kingship with, the mythical Theseus, and then you later that generates to the tyrants, people like Draco, and then you have obviously, an oligarchy, aristocracy oligarchy arises. You then have, classical Athens, the Athenian democracy, degenerating into mob rule. But then instead of Athens becoming a kingship again, what really happens is that Athens no longer is the major player in the Greek world, and it's actually Macedon and Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire and the creation of all of these Hellenistic kingdoms. That is the revival of the Greek monarchy in the Greek world. It's not Athens becoming a monarchy. It is simply Macedon usurping the mantle of the dominant power and then spreading this institution over like vast tracts of land, which I thought was a very interesting analysis.
Right, but it also needs to be mentioned that after the collapse of the Macedonian Empire in the Diadochi Wars, which you, I, and who was the other guy we were with when we covered the Diadochi?
Furious,
yes. The Greek city-states reassert their independence, and Macedon never really asserts control over Attica or the Peloponnesus or Boeotia. And in fact, that leads them into conflict with Rome, which sets off the Macedonian Wars. So a lot of these city-states return to more traditional forms of government. They're mostly recorded by Polybius and Plutarch. We don't, even those of us who are inclined towards a Western historical perspective, don't often hear very much about this. And the monarchical element in Greece, I mean, Sparta still has kings, I guess, right? So it's still there. But it ends up being, because the Macedonians lose their grip, it returns back to this eclectic, squabbling city-states, many of whom still are inspired by the more traditional Greek forms of government.
Oh, no, thank you for that. And now we come to Lycurgus. For the present, I will make a brief reference to the legislation of Lycurgus, for such a discussion is not at all alien to my subject. That statesman was fully aware that all those changes which I have enumerated come about by an undeviating law of nature, and reflected that every form of government that was unmixed and rested on one species of power was unstable, because it was swiftly perverted into that particular form of evil peculiar to it and inherent in its nature. But just as rust is the natural dissolvement of iron, woodworms and grubs to timber, by which they are destroyed without any external injury, but by that which is engendered in themselves, so in each constitution there is naturally engendered a particular vice inseparable from it. In kingship it is absolutism, in aristocracy it is oligarchy, in democracy lawless ferocity and violence, and to these vicious states all these forms of government are, as I have lately shown, inevitably transformed. Lycurgus, I say, saw all this and accordingly combined together all the excellences and distinctive features of the best constitutions, that no part should become unduly predominant and be perverted into its kindred vice, and that each power being checked by the others, no one part should turn the scale or decisively outbalance the others, but that by being accurately adjusted and in exact equilibrium, the whole might remain long steady like a ship sailing close to the wind. The royal power was prevented from growing insolent by fear of the people, which had also assigned to it an adequate share in the constitution. The people, in their turn, were restrained from a bold contempt of the kings by fear of the Gerousia, the members of which, being selected on grounds of merit, were certain to throw their influence on the side of justice in every question that arose, and thus the party placed at a disadvantage by its conservative tendency was always strengthened and supported by the weight and influence of the Gerousia. The result of this combination has been that the Lacedaemonians retain their freedom for the longest period of any people with which we are acquainted. Lycurgus, however, established his constitution without the discipline of adversity, because he was able to foresee by the light of reason the course which events naturally take and the source from which they come. But though the Romans have arrived at the same result in framing their commonwealth, they have not done so by means of abstract reasoning, but through many struggles and difficulties, and by continually adopting reforms from the knowledge gained in disaster. The result has been a constitution like that of Lycurgus, and the best of any existing in my time. And again, it's interesting, he's drawing this direct comparison between Rome and Lycurgus, the Spartan constitution. And what I find interesting when you're sort of looking at the two of these is almost like there's like a dare I say, a separation of powers baked into the system. It's almost like the kingship, the aristocracy, and the democracy are all separate institutions that all counterbalance each other. So it's almost like a classical version of a Montesquieu's, the separation of powers.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. And no, that's fine. And this is interesting because in this way, it sort of works, because I know some people like AA are very skeptical of separation of powers, and the thing is, it depends on the circumstances. If you have a order where you have a entrenched powerful elite, and that elite control all three institutions in that make up the separation of powers, then yes, they are all going to move along in lockstep. However, when all those institutions are not controlled by the same people, they do genuinely counterbalance each other and actually do work as they are intended.
Right. So I think one thing that's interesting is I think this might differ somewhat from Plutarch's account of Lycurgus, but Polybius argues that Lycurgus, quote, because he was able to foresee by the light of reason the course of events would naturally take and the course from which they would come. They had not, okay, and then he says the Romans had not achieved this by abstract reasoning. So he's saying that Lycurgus did. So the idea that you can centrally plan a society, yes, you can. And that Lycurgus constitution lasted for 400 or 500 years, almost as long as the Roman Republic. So checkmate Lolberts, right? But the idea, so this, if we're going to get into this debate between the division of powers between three branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and then you're going to have a single political ruler in which all of that power is given, sort of like a ancient pharaoh. Pharaoh would have had all those powers, or some Chinese emperor maybe. The question then becomes, okay, so you could say the entire concept of anacyclosis is that any political system is going to decay over time. And then Plato and Aristotle sort of get the ball rolling by talking about this, and Polybius is kind of, the next level of reflection on this. The problem is that still holds for a system like that, where you have a single political ruler. There's two very good examples of what happens that are catastrophic when this happens. The first one is the Roman Empire itself. The Roman Empire in the West especially was brought down due to civil war after civil war after civil war, where everybody would, march their legions to Rome to fight for the supreme power. And this culminates finally in the 5th century, where you have the master of horse, who's a German, Latinized German named, I can't think of his name now. He was
Stilicho?
No, it wasn't Stilicho. There was a third guy who killed Emperor Majorian because he was probably because he was fearful of what happened to Stilicho. I'll think of him later. He went around just, in order to keep the purple for himself, just killed all the emperors around him, even successful ones. And of course, Stilicho and Aetius were killed by their emperors because they were considered threats, even though they defeated the barbarians. And so what ends up happening is you have the circular firing squad, where the stakes are victory or death. Everybody just keeps killing each other because there's no graceful way out. You either win or you die. The second good example is England's War of the Roses, where the House Plantagenet was completely decimated by the Civil War, because there were no, the only reason why Henry VII got in the first place was because everybody else who had a claim to the throne was killed. I mean, he was so far outside the line of succession. Ricimer was the master of horse I was talking about. But he was so far out of the line of succession, he never would have got in. And that was a 30-year civil war. That was awful. Like, nobody in Britain thought that was a great time to be alive. So this is what you end up with. You end up with this circular firing squad where everybody around the purple starts killing each other, because if you don't have it, you can't be secure of life. But if you're in there, everybody's gunning for you.
And one other thought that's come to my mind is, Polybius talks about the idea of, oligarchy or mob rule. It all turns to violence and amongst the citizens. Well, I remember, because one of the things that just before the crisis of the 3rd century, you have I think it's Caracalla. He's the one who extends Roman citizenship to everybody in the empire, and it's just interesting, isn't it? It's almost like, I'm going to enfranchise every subject of the Roman Empire, and then they have a massive civil war immediately afterwards. It's like literally, mass violence as all these people can, now become like Roman legionaries, and then it's the various barracks emperors.
Well, the other thing that's interesting, though, is that the enfranchisement wasn't the result of the Roman Republic, but a Roman emperor.
Yes, it kind of goes back to my point, this idea that the Principate specifically almost is this, the first citizen is the champion of the people and is going to keep extending the rights of the mass as a counterweight to the Senate. Because it's also interesting, because if we go back to when we had the 5 good emperors, remember the origins of the 5 good emperors they were all from senatorial families. So it's interesting, isn't it? You have this early imperial period dominated by the Julio-Claudians. Then you have this period where these senatorial families are dominating the succession, and then you have the Septimine dynasty trying to strengthen their own power by using the enfranchising the mass against the Senate.
Well, the reasons why the crisis of the 3rd century is about 50 years after the end of the last of the 5 good emperors. But you see, the reason why the 5 good emperors were good is they weren't hereditary; they were by appointment. All those emperors appointed successors, and later commentators noticed that was an important factor. And this goes back to the very beginning of the whole discussion about the rise of a strong man who's brave and courageous. As long as he has to prove himself and it doesn't become hereditary, that system works. When it becomes hereditary, they then wear different clothes, they then have wealth accumulated, and they become a kind of second class, which is distinct from the people they rule over. Whereas the 5 good emperors were adopted. Each emperor would then adopt or choose a successor. In fact, that's how Julius Caesar himself chose a successor. Octavius was adopted. And so I think what we see here is the superiority of adoption or appointment succession rather than hereditary succession, because in each of these cases where we find an appointment succession, the successor is often quite very good. And Marcus Aurelius goofed up when he let his son Commodus become emperor. That was a hereditary decision, and Commodus was horrible. And he was, I think, strangling a bathtub by a gladiator. I mean, the guy was a mess. And also Caracalla, I mean, one of the reasons why he extended citizenship to everybody in the empire was it forced them into military service, because he was, I think, campaigning against the Parthians, and I think died fighting the Parthians. And so he needed extra troops in order to fight. So obviously that has ripple consequences, but that's why Caracalla did that.
If anything, I think that emboldens my point, doesn't it? It's like you're turning the mass of citizens into these legionaries who are now going to be the weapons used by these various officers to take the throne and become barracks emperors.
Which ultimately brings down the Roman Empire itself.
Well, we have the transformation of the Principate to the dominate of Diocletian. So,
right, and so, but the interesting thing here is when you had a mixed government under the Republic, there wasn't pressure to enfranchise everyone equally.
No, there wasn't. Well, let's move on. So, the Roman Constitution. I've given an account of the Constitution of Lycurgus. I will now endeavour to describe that of Rome at the period of their disastrous defeat at Cannae. I'm fully conscious that to those who actually live under this constitution, I shall appear to give an inadequate account of it by the omission of certain details. Knowing accurately every portion of it from personal experience, from having been bred up in its customs and laws from childhood, they will not be struck so much by the accuracy of the description as annoyed by its omissions, nor will they believe that the historian has purposely omitted unimportant distinctions, but will attribute his silence upon the origin of existing institutions or other important facts of it to ignorance. What is told they depreciate as insignificant or beside their purpose. What is omitted they desiderate as vital to the question, the object being to appear to know more than the writers. But a good critic should not judge a writer by what he leaves unsaid, but from what he says. If he detects misstatement in the latter, he may then feel certain that ignorance accounts for the former. But if what he says is accurate, his omissions ought to be attributed to deliberate judgment and not to ignorance. So much for those whose criticisms are prompted by personal ambitions rather than by justice. Another requisite for obtaining a judicious approval for historical disquisition is that it should be germane to the matter in hand. If this is not observed, though its style may be excellent and its matter irreproachable, it will seem out of place and disgust rather than please. As for the Roman constitution, it had 3 elements, each of them possessing sovereign powers, and their respective share of power in the whole state had been regulated with such a scrupulous regard to equality and equilibrium that no one could say for certain, not even a native, whether the constitution as a whole were an aristocracy. or democracy or despotism, and no wonder, for if we confine our observation to the power of the consuls, we should be inclined to regard it as despotic, if on that of the Senate as aristocratic, and if finally one looks at the power possessed by the people, it would seem a clear case of a democracy. What the exact powers of these several parts were and still, with slight modifications, are in our state. The consuls. The consuls, before leading out with the legions, remain in Rome and are supreme masters of the administration. All other magistrates except the tribunes are under them and take their orders. They introduce foreign ambassadors to the Senate, bring matters requiring deliberation before it, and see to the execution of its decrees. If again there are any matters of the state which require the authorization of the people, it is their business to see to them, to summon the popular meetings, to bring their proposals before them, and to carry out the decrees of the majority. In the preparations for war also, and in the words, in the entire administration of a campaign, they have all but absolute power. It is competent to them to impose on the allies such levies as they think good, to appoint the military tribunes to make up the roll for soldiers, and set those that are suitable. Besides, they have absolute power of inflicting punishment on all who are under their command while on active service, and they have authority to expend as much of the public money as they choose, being accompanied by a questor who is entirely at their orders. A survey of these powers would in fact justify our describing the constitution as despotic, a clear case of royal government, nor will it affect the truth of my description if any of the institutions I have described are changed in our time or in that of our posterity, and the same remarks apply to what follows. So it's interesting, isn't it, that the consul, though having certain constitutional restrictions on what he can do, when it comes to military matters, he's effectively an absolute monarch. He's a king in all but name.
Right, and that's why when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, that was such a big deal, because Imperium was not granted at that stage in history to consuls inside of Italy. I mean, obviously, originally Rome was only within the Italian peninsula, so that's a little different. But within the territory that was, the core of Rome, you couldn't bring that power in, which is why Sulla was so hated, because he sacked Rome with that power. Plutarch also points out that by having two consuls with absolute power, the original theory, right, is to check each other, and to some extent that worked. But the problem when you get to the late Republic with Caesar and Pompey is that neither one wants to stand down now, right? Once you have an army with all of this stuff and absolute authority, and you both have to go into Italy to do, business and to do politics, neither one wants to disarm, because now the incentives are different. Well, if I disarm and the other guy doesn't, then I'll just get killed, and vice versa. And so ultimately what in part brought down the Roman Republic was the runaway success that Polybius is at the front end of, which leads to basically consuls with the power of an emperor afield. I mean, Caesar would have been indistinguishable from Alexander the Great in the field, even though one was a king and one was supposed to be a military official under civilian management.
No, certainly, thank you. And there's an interesting question in the chat from Michael Hasler. Who would be America parallel to the five good emperors? Oh God, I don't know enough to really comment on that. I'm tempted to say maybe the first five from like Washington through like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, because they're all like founding fathers. They all seem pretty competent. That's like the short answer.
I'll go with that. The first five presidents, I think, were founding fathers. So, yeah.
Well, there we go. We hope that satisfactorily answers your question, Michael Hasler. So, right. The Senate. The Senate has first of all the control of the treasury and regulates the receipts and disbursements alike. For the quaestors cannot issue any public money for the various departments of the state without a decree of the Senate, except for the service of the consuls. The Senate controls also what is by far the largest and most important expenditure, that namely which is made by the censors every lustrum for their repair or construction of public buildings. This money cannot be obtained by the censors except by the grant of the Senate. Similarly, all crimes committed in Italy requiring a public investigation, such as treason, conspiracy, poisoning, or willful murder, are in the hands of the Senate. Besides, if any individual or state among the Italian allies requires a controversy to be settled, a penalty to be assessed, help or protection to be afforded, all this in the province of the Senate, or again outside Italy if it is necessary to send an embassy to reconcile warring communities or to remind them of their duty, or sometimes to impose requisitions upon them, or to receive their submission, or finally to proclaim war against them. This too is the business of the Senate. In like manner, the reception to be given to foreign ambassadors in Rome and the answers to be returned to them are decided by the Senate. With such business, the people have nothing to do. Consequently, if one were staying at Rome when the consuls were not in town, one would imagine the constitution to be a complete aristocracy. And this has been the idea entertained by many Greeks, and by many kings as well, from the fact that nearly all business they had with Rome was settled by the Senate. So it's interesting, the Senate very much controls a lot of the day-to-day administration of Rome, but also a lot of the foreign affairs and relations. And it's interesting, isn't it, if you think about it? We just talked about the idea of the consul being like a military absolute monarch. It's almost like the Senate could take war to Rome, and that could be a war the consul may not particularly agree with, and yet he's forced to lead an army in such a campaign anyway.
Yeah. Well, and again, because he's outside of the political entity of Rome, different rules apply. And I think this is where, I guess if we want to tie this back around, we could have to talk about the friend-enemy distinction, right? So, which is derived from the Roman conception of being at war with a neighboring country. In that social category, a whole different set of rules apply versus being in at peace, within the Roman polity, right? So outside of that, you have this supreme power, and so, but then inside you don't. And what's interesting here is the Senate controls the purse strings, which in the United States context is given to the Congress, but it's the same basic principle, right? There's some body within the organization of the political system which holds the purse strings. And so one of the things that we'll see, right? You mentioned the consul already. So if he wants to go on a campaign, well, he can't upset all the senators now, can he? Because he needs money for procurements.
Certainly, and I have to say, I find the idea of a legislator controlling the budget a disaster waiting to happen, personally.
Because they're just going to want to vote more expenditures to grow their own business.
Yes, and on all these various other revolting projects they want to splash money on.
Well, I think in ancient times, what you could do with money was a lot less than you can do now.
Fair.
So the danger that you're looking at right now in the modern West is not really a danger that, because, for example, the idea, the Senate had the money and they racked Pompey. But Caesar had the better trained army and was able by force of arms to take control of the country. That's something we in the United States don't really think is possible anymore. Not saying it can't happen, but it's unlikely. And so we have a skewed view of what's possible.
Well, I mean, isn't the president the commander-in-chief of the military? So hypothetically, it could happen.
Yes, hypothetically. But we're more likely to see. But the danger that we're more likely to be attuned to is misappropriations of funds.
Yeah, pretty much. On the people. After this, one would naturally be inclined to ask what part is left for the people in the constitution when the Senate has these various functions, especially the control of the receipts and the expenditure of the exchequer, and when the consuls again have absolute power over the details of military preparation and absolute authority in the field. There is, however, a part left for the people, and it is a most important one. The people is the sole fountain of honor and of punishment, and it is by these two things that these alone that dynasties and constitutions, and in a word, human society, are held together. For where the distinction between them is not sharply drawn, both in theory and practice, there no undertaking can be properly administered, as indeed we might expect when good and bad are held in exactly the same honor. The people then are the only court to decide matters of life and death, and even in cases where the penalty is money, if the sum to be assessed is sufficiently serious, and especially when the accused have held the higher magistracies, and in regard to this arrangement, there is one point deserving a special commendation and record. Men who are on trial for their lives at Rome, while sentences in process of being voted, if even only one of the tribes whose votes are needed to ratify the sentence has not voted, had the privilege at Rome of openly departing and condemning themselves to a voluntary exile. Such men are safe at Naples or Praenesta or at Tibur, and at others with which this arrangement has been duly ratified on oath. Again, it is the people who bestow offices on the deserving, which are the most honourable rewards of virtue. It has also the absolute power of passing or repealing laws, and most important of all, it is the people who deliberate on the question of peace or war. And when provisional terms are made for alliance, suspension of hostilities or treaties, it is the people who ratify them or the reverse. These considerations again will lead one to say that the chief power in the state was the people's and that the constitution was a democracy. Again, sorry, I was muted. Sorry. Yeah, again, I find this interesting that there's this idea that despite everything the consuls and the senators do, it all has to be like quote unquote rubber stamped with the approval of the people and the elections of these various people to various offices, and the idea to carry the support of the people of Rome.
Well, right, but you see, the reasoning behind this with the Roman tribunate is the same we see in the ancient Greek city-states, which is also the same we saw in the 18th century. If you want people to fight in your armies, you have to give them skin in the game. And so, unless you have mass conscripts like, say, the Persian Empire or the Soviets, you have to give the people some reason to get invested. And as a form of power projection, which the West uses historically, you have to give them some sort of in. And in all likelihood, they're not going to become chief magistrates, but having them believe that they have a stake in the current system and that you can arm them without fear of them turning those arms against you, right? It's twofold. You don't want them to, you want to recruit them into your army to increase your combat power, but you also don't want them to turn those weapons against you. So in a video I did a few years back on the roundtable about the Second Amendment, Madison clearly states that the Europeans don't want their citizens to have guns because they'll just turn them against them. And Madison is like, well, that's why we want our people to have guns so that they can overthrow the government if the government gets tyrannical. And so that's the rationalization behind this. And if you're being pressured by, like, say, Persia with a large conscript army, this kind of sounds sensible, because how are you going to muster enough men to meet the Persians on anything close to parity?
No, certainly. And it's also, I think, this idea of getting the approval of the people is very important. What comes to my mind is Plutarch's Life of Coriolanus, the Roman dictator who went to war with the Volsci, because Coriolanus' downfall is that he's not very well liked by the people of Rome, and rather than just shrugging it off and trying to win them over, he just acts very scornfully towards them, and in the end he just buggers off, defects to the Volsci, where he adopts the name Coriolanus after the town of Corioli, which was being fought over, and then he ends up leading the Volsci to come and conquer, or almost conquer Rome, and the people there they're at his feet and they're begging to be spared, and he feels utter shame in that moment, and so again, I thought that was a very interesting angle of it as well.
Right. Because ultimately, if you want to have a political system that is stable, you do want all the different elements to be more or less satisfied with the status quo. If any one of those elements becomes extremely dissatisfied, then you have grounds for future civil disturbances.
No, certainly. Okay. Division of political power at Rome. Such then is the distribution of power between the several parts of the state. I must now show how each of these several parts can, when they choose, oppose or support each other. The consul then, when he has started on an expedition with the powers I have described, is to all appearance absolute in the administration of the business in hand. Still, he has need of the support both of people and senate, and without them is quite unable to bring the matter to a successful conclusion, for it is plain that he must have supplies sent to his legions from time to time, but without a decree of the senate they can be supplied neither with corn, nor clothes, nor pay, so that all the plans of a commander must be futile if the senate is resolved either to shrink from danger or hamper his plans. And again, whether a consul shall bring any undertaking to a conclusion or no depends entirely upon the Senate, for it has absolute authority at the end of a year to send another consul to supersede him or to continue the existing one in his command. Again, even to the successors of the generals, the Senate has the power to add distinction and glory, and on the other hand, to obscure their merits and lower their credit. For all these high achievements are brought in tangible form before the eyes of the citizens by what we call triumphs. But these triumphs the commanders cannot celebrate with proper pomp, or in some cases celebrate at all, unless the Senate concurs and grants the necessary money. As for the people, the consuls are preeminently obliged to court their favour, however distant from home may be the field of their operations, for it is the people, as I've said before, that ratifies or refuses to ratify terms of peace and treaties. But most of all, because when laying down their office, they have to give an account of their administration before it. Therefore, in no case is it safe for the consuls to neglect either the Senate or the goodwill of the people. Again, this idea of the consul or on military command overseas needing the support to prosecute it, I can't help but think back to our Scipio stream and some of the troubles he has in Sicily and later in Africa. It's like these jealous senators don't quite want to give him all of the resources necessary for him to be a conquering hero.
Yeah, and that's not just a problem with senators, right? Belisarius in the Gothic Wars didn't get the sources he needed because Justinian was afraid that he might become a rival to him. And I think that rival potential is what gets a lot of these guys, whether they want to or not. I don't think Scipio or Belisarius wanted supreme authority, but their opponents didn't care about that. And so, but yeah, the people were, as he says, are the ones that confer honors in a triumph. And so it would behoove, and then Caesar, of course, played that game very well. That's how he became the demagogue that swept power. In his triumphs, he gave all sorts of honors to the people. There was a saying, he found Rome a city of wood, but left it a city of marble.
Well, that was Augustus.
Oh, Augustus. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. But we're close enough, considering it was his adopted father. So, right. Okay. The Senate controlled by the people. As for the Senate, which possesses the immense power I have described, in the first place, it is obliged in public affairs to take the multitude into account and respect the wishes of the people, and it cannot put into execution the penalty for offences against the Republic, which are punishable with death unless the people first ratify its decrees. Similarly, even in matters which directly affect the senators, for instance, in the case of a law diminishing the Senate's traditional authority, or depriving senators of certain dignities and offices, or even actually cutting down their property, even in such cases the people have the sole power of passing or rejecting the law. But most important of all is the fact that if the tribunes interpose their veto, the Senate not only are unable to pass a decree, but cannot even hold a meeting at all, whether formal or informal. Now the tribunes are always bound to carry out the decree of the people, above all things to have regard to their wishes. Therefore, for all these reasons, the Senate stands in awe of the multitude and cannot neglect the feelings of the people. And the powers of the Senate. In like manner, the people on its part is far from being independent of the Senate, and is bound to take its wishes into account both collectively and individually. For contracts, too numerous to count, are given out by the censors in all parts of Italy. The repairs or construction of public buildings. There is also the collection of revenue for many rivers, harbours, gardens, mines, and land, everything, in a word, that comes under the control of the Roman government, and in all these the people at large are engaged, so that there is scarcely a man, so to speak, who is not interested either as a contractor or as being employed in the works. For some purchase the contracts from the censors for themselves, and others go partners with them, while others again go security for these contractors, or actually pledge their property to the treasury for them. Now, over all these transactions, the Senate has absolute control. It can grant an extension of time, and in case of unforeseen accident, can relieve the contractors from a portion of their obligation, or release them from it altogether. If they are absolutely unable to fulfill it, and there are many details in which the Senate can inflict great hardships, or, on the other hand, grant great indulgences to the contractors, but in every case the appeal is to it. But the most important point of all is that the judges are taken from its members in the majority of trials, whether public or private, in which the charges are heavy. Consequently, all citizens are much at its mercy, and being alarmed at the uncertainty as to when they may need its aid, are cautious about resisting or actively opposing its will. And for a similar reason, men do not rashly resist the wishes of the consuls, because one and all may become subject to their absolute authority on the campaign. And interdependency brings strength. The result of this power of the several states for mutual help or harm is a union sufficiently firm for all emergencies, and a constitution than which it is impossible to find a better. For whenever any danger from without compels them to unite and work together, the strength which is developed by the state is so extraordinarily, and that everything required is unfeignedly carried out by the eager rivalry shown by all classes to devote their whole minds to the needs of the hour, and secure that any determination come to should not fail for want of promptitude, while each individual's works privately and publicly alike, for the accomplishment of the business in hand, Accordingly, the peculiar constitution of the state makes it irresistible and certain of obtaining whatever it determines to attempt. Nay, even when these external alarms are past, and the people are enjoying their good fortune, fruits of their victories, and as usually happens, growing corrupted by flattery and idleness, show a tendency to violence and arrogance, it is in these circumstances more than ever that the constitution is seen to possess within itself the power of correcting abuses. For when any one of these three classes becomes puffed up and manifests an inclination to be contentious and unduly encroaching, the mutual independency of all three, and the possibility of the pretensions of any one being checked and thwarted by the others, must plainly check this tendency, and so the proper equilibrium is maintained by the impulsiveness of the one part being checked by fear of the other. And I think the ultimate thing why you see this Roman system work so well together is ultimately all parts of it have skin in the game. They all have something to lose if the system falls apart or doesn't work ultimately. And you can almost say, why is the Roman state so enduring against the onslaught of Hannibal during the Second Punic War? And it's because everybody has an investment in the glory of Rome and in the survival of the people and the constitution, and so there's an incentive to work together or they'll face oblivion.
Yes, and of course what ultimately brings down this equilibrium is that one of these elements ceases to be equal, the consulship. By the time you get to the 1st century, consuls are wielding literal power on the battlefield equivalent to an emperor. Again, Alexander the Great with his army, it's like Issus, had an army about the same size as Caesar at Alesia. So Caesar is wielding, this kind of royal authority, or Pompey in his campaigns in the East. And so now the populace and the Senate just don't really have any meaningful way of checking this tension, which is why the Senate chooses Pompey, because they think he's more malleable. Now, in the Western context, the subversion of the powers in the United States was not due to military authority, but it was due to if the Senate controlling the purse strings represents the financial interests, it was the runaway financial interests that upset the balance of power in the in this finely balanced system, so that it had this runaway power growth, which the other two elements of our government couldn't control. And so that's where it works, as long as one group doesn't find some game-breaking hack that just creates a whole new game where the two other players just can't even compete.
But it's interesting, isn't it? The consuls have the ultimate imperium or military power, whereas the Senate has the ultimate financial power. So in this struggle with the civil wars, it's almost like the military power trumps the money power.
Yes, and the reason why that's the case is, I think, at least twofold. Caesar, of course, was very generous in giving gifts to his soldiers, so he was buying loyalty. And of course, if you control an army, you can just go over the frontier and loot the next civilization next to you. But in our day and age, unlike in ancient Rome, we don't really have a social order based on kinship ties, trust, honor, and respect. In which case, money doesn't change hands. A lot of the machinery of society was not greased with money. It was this sense of a connection based on trust, based on experience, based on social bonds. Whereas and that's what the military really thrives on. The military really thrives on building strong social bonds. I mean, right? You're willing to die for these guys, and they're willing to die for you. Can't get stronger than that, right? Nowadays in the West, we have a totally different setup. This is what can you do for me, right? It's called it's the rule of number one, and in that case, a kind of military power would be very difficult to develop.
No, that's an interesting thought there. Okay, so that's the last bit before we get to the stuff on the army. So let's get the last few bits on constitution. So, okay. The Roman Republic compared with others. Nearly all historians have recorded as constitutions of eminent excellence those of Lacedaemon, Crete, Mantinea, and Carthage. Some have also mentioned those of Athens and Thebes. The former I may allow to pass, but I am convinced that little need be said of the Athenian and Theban constitutions. Their growth was abnormal, their period of zenith brief, and their changes they experienced unusually violent. Their glory was a sudden and fortuitous flash, so to speak, and while they still thought themselves prosperous and likely to remain so, they found themselves involved in circumstances completely the reverse. The Thebans got their reputation for valour among the Greeks by taking advantage of the census policy of the Lacedaemonians and their hatred of the allies towards them, owing to the valour of one, or at most two, men who were wise enough to appreciate the situation, since fortune quickly made it evident that it was not the peculiarity of their constitution, but the valour of their leaders which gave the Thebans their success. For the great power of Thebes notoriously took its rise, attained its zenith, and fell to the ground with the lives of Epaminondas and Pelopidas. We must therefore conclude that it was not its constitution, but its men that caused the high fortune which it then enjoyed.
Let me just. Oh, were you going to say something?
I was just about to say, I think that's a very interesting analysis of Thebes. Thebes has this very brief window of dominance after the Battle of Leuctra, and because those are the two commanders, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, who won that victory at Leuctra. But once they're gone, Thebes' brief window of dominance disappeared.
So I want to add. Now, I find this to be a strange statement from Polybius, because the Theban hegemony doesn't really end until Macedon. So the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, it's Athenian soldiers and Theban soldiers fighting the Macedonians. Sparta does not send any troops in this enterprise. And so Thebes is still considered one of the leading military powers in Greece. Now, granted, it's not very long, but it doesn't end with the life of Epaminondas and Pelopidas. They were the leading coalition leader against Philip. And yeah, they were defeated, but still the 300 was renowned. When they were defeated, Philip did honorary funeral rites for the 300 Theban sacred band members. So it's not quite the life of Epaminondas. It lasted a little bit longer. I think that's a little unfair, but Thebes otherwise did have a very short time.
Look, I mean, Leuctra, if I recall, I think was 378 BC, and Chaeronea, I think, was 338, so it's about 40 years.
About 4 years. Yeah.
Maybe it's fair to say that Epaminondas and Pelopidas created Thebes as a great power, but ultimately, perhaps Thebes' inability to, I think, maintain such great men as them ensured her decline long term. Is that more fair?
Well, to be fair, nobody could stand up to the Macedonians, because even Sparta, people tend to forget this. While Alexander the Great was away on campaign, the Persians had been bribing Spartans to rise up and fight the Macedonians. And in 331, which I think was the same year as the Battle of Gaugamela, there's a Spartan attack there's a Macedonian attack by Antipater on the Spartans at Megalopolis, where they're completely decimated. The Spartans are just completely decimated. So really, I think Macedon just sort of broke the game. It broke the meta. Like nobody could stand up to Macedon, not Athens, not Thebes, not Sparta. So I think really the explanation is that, absent this mercurial rise of Macedon, it's hard to tell what Thebes might have accomplished.
No, certainly. Okay, so next we have the Athenian constitution. A somewhat similar remark applies to the Athenian constitution also, but though it perhaps has more frequent interludes of excellence, yet its highest perfection was attained during the brilliant career of Themistocles, and having reached that point, it quickly declined owing to its essential instability. For the Athenian demos is always in the position of a ship without a commander. In such a ship, if fear of the enemy or the occurrence of a storm induce the crew to be of one mind and to obey the helmsman, everything goes well. But if they recover from this fear and begin to treat their officers with contempt and to quarrel with each other because they are no longer all of one mind, one party wishing to continue the voyage and the other urging the steersman to bring the ship to anchor, some letting out the sheets and others hauling them in, and ordering the sails to be furled, their discord and quarrels make a sorry show to lookers on, and the position of affairs is full of risks to those on board engaged on the same voyage. And the result has often been that after escaping the dangers of the wider seas and the most violent storms, they wreck their ship in harbour and close to shore. And this is what has often happened to the Athenian constitution. But after repelling on various occasions the greatest and most formidable dangers by the valour of its people and their leaders, there have been times when, in periods of secure tranquility, it has gratuitously and recklessly encountered disaster. Therefore, I need say no more about either it or the Theban constitution, in both of which a mob manages everything on its own unfettered impulse, a mob in the one city distinguished for headlong outbursts of fiery temper, in the other trained in long habits of violence and ferocity. Do you know what I find really fascinating, Todd, about this passage? Thomas Carlyle has a very similar passage in the present time. He literally compares democracy to a ship without a captain, and like all the various crew members are arguing amongst themselves how to steer the ship.
I think Plato has a similar passage as well. But again, can you scroll down to the bottom half of this chapter here? Because he says something that, again, I don't know where he's coming from here. It just is bizarre. He says, for after repelling on various occasions the greatest and most formidable dangers by the valor of its people and their leaders, they have been times when in periods of secure tranquility is gratuitously and recklessly encountered disaster. Well, the only obvious disaster that I know that befell Athens was the Sicilian expedition, which was during war. During peacetime, the Athenian, quote, constitution was preserved intact. By losing to Sparta, they imposed the 30 tyrants and oligarchies established. The oligarchy is overthrown, the government returns, and is still a, quote, democracy by the time of Philip. So the idea that disaster would befall a democracy would be in wartime, not peacetime. So I don't know where Polybius is getting this from. This to me just seems very strange.
I don't know. Maybe he's just being biased towards Athens.
That would seem to be the most likely explanation, the bias towards the Athenians. But I think also too, this does bear to be pointed out. What is meant by democracy? So in the modern context, when you're dealing with NRX or people like academic agent, whatever, there's this kind of like parity position, which actually does exist, where some on the far left believe that everybody in any given decision-making process should all vote on it equally. And you get to a certain point where if you're like, there's the idea of democratic control of factories called participatory economics, and the question then becomes, well, how could you ever make any decisions? You spend all day voting on what's going to be done. And that kind of parity position does exist amongst modern people. But I think what needs to be remembered is in classical times and then throughout the Western political debate, that's not what's meant by democracy. What's meant by democracy in Athens, let's go to Athens because that's the one we're talking about. There was an aristocratic class. They were called the Bulimen, and they were elected to serve terms by having what they call a blind a lottery, where you write down the guy's name on a pot shard, throw it into a pile, and start counting it later. And then they would make a vote, and then the assembly of the Athenian people would then vote for or against any given proposition. They're not the ones coming up with the ideas necessarily, though I suppose any one of them could have run for office. The question is, though, when the Bulimen produce a vote, some policy to vote on, then the people have a say, which unlike say Xerxes in Herodotus' description of the Persian Wars, he just makes decisions regardless of anybody's opinion, whether it's his nobility, whether it's the people. And that's what Athens represents, which is not the sort of modern day cartoon caricature that some on the far left would advocate. Because, you're right. You can't have literally everybody voting every single time on an issue. You never get anything done.
No, certainly not. Okay. The Cretan constitution compared to Spartan. Passing to the Cretan polity, there are 2 points which deserve our consideration. First is how such writers as Ephorus, Xenophon, Callisthenes, and Plato, who are the most learned of the ancients, could assert that it was like that of Sparta, and secondly, how they came to assert that it was at all admirable. I can agree with neither assertion, and I will explain why I say so. And first, as to its dissimilarity with the Spartan constitution, the peculiar merit of the latter is said to be its land laws, by which no one possesses more than another, but all citizens have an equal share in the public land. The next distinctive feature regards the possession of money, but as it is utterly discredited among them, the jealous competition which arises from inequality of wealth is entirely removed from the city. A third peculiarity of the Lacedaemonian polity is that of the officials by whose hands and with whose advice the whole government is conducted, The kings hold a hereditary office, while the members of the Gerousia are elected for life. The greed among the Cretans. Among the Cretans, the exact reverse of all these arrangements obtains. The laws allow them to possess as much land as they can get, with no limitation whatsoever. Money is so highly valued among them that its possession is not only thought to be necessary, but in the highest degree creditable. And in fact, greed and avarice are so native to the soil in Crete that they are the only people in the world among whom no stigma attaches to any sort of gain whatever. Again, all their offices are annual and on a democratical footing. I have therefore often felt at a loss to account for these writers speaking of the two constitutions, which are radically different, as though they were closely united and allied. But besides overlooking these important differences, these writers have gone out of their way to comment at length on the legislation of Lycurgus. He was the only legislator, they say, who saw the important point, for there being two things on which the safety of a commonwealth depends: courage in the face of the enemy and concord at home. By abolishing covetousness, he with it removed all motive for civil broil and contest, whence it has been brought about that the Lacedaemonians are the best governed and most united people in Greece. Yet while giving utterance to these sentiments, and though they see that, in contrast to this, the Cretans, by their ingrained avarice, are engaged in countless public and private seditions, murders, and civil wars, they yet regard these facts as not affecting their contention, but are bold enough to speak of the two constitutions as alike. Ephorus, indeed, putting aside names, employs impressions as so precisely the same when discoursing on the two constitutions, that unless one noticed the proper names, there would be no means whatever of distinguishing which of the two he was describing. I mean, this is interesting, this idea that, Crete, it's there's no limit to what land can be sort of divvied out for the people, and Sparta, it's a lot more regulated. It's important to remember that the Spartan, one of the problems of Sparta you get towards the latter years in the sort of 3rd century is there's a decline in the amount of the homoi, the Spartan citizens, to go on the Goki training, because there's a concentration of property in the upper classes, and so you have the attempted reforms of Agis and Cleomenes, who attempt to try and distribute this land amongst the people in order to create more Spartan hoplites and citizens. So, no, I just thought that was an interesting comparison.
Well, it's also interesting is that, contrary to Aristotle, Aristotle actually thought the Cretan constitution was similar to the Lacedaemonians. So I think he's actually criticizing Aristotle without naming Aristotle. But since he's doing that and not providing Aristotle's arguments, which I don't remember what they are at this point, it's a little hard to verify the accuracy of his claims here.
But it's almost like I'm going to criticize this revered intellectual, but I won't name him directly out of respect.
Yes, yes, or out of having your feet held to the fire. Though it'd be funny though. Paul in the book of Titus says that the Cretans are evil gluttons and liars. So apparently, even as late as the time of the Christian era, this opinion was still held of the Cretans.
No, certainly. Okay. What makes a constitution good, and what difference between them consists, I've already stated. I will now address myself to showing that the Cretan constitution deserves no praise nor imitation. To my mind, then, there are two things fundamental to every state in virtue of which its powers and constitution become desirable or objectionable. These are customs and laws. Of these, the desirable are those which make men's private lives holy and pure, and the public character of the state civilized and just. The objectionable are those whose effect is the reverse. As then, when we see good customs and good laws prevailing among certain people, we confidently assume that, in consequence of them, the men in their civil constitution will be good also. So when we see private life full of covetousness and the public policy of injustice, plainly we have reason for asserting their laws, particular customs, and general constitution to be bad. Now, with few exceptions, you could find no habits prevailing in private life more steeped in treachery than those in Crete, and no public policy more inequitable, holding then the Cretan constitution to be neither like the Spartan nor worthy of choice or imitation, are ejected from the comparison which I have instituted. Nor again would it be fair to introduce the Republic of Plato, which is also spoken of in high terms by some philosophers. For just as we refuse admission to the athletic contest to those actors or athletes who have not acquired a recognised position or trained for them, so we ought not to admit this Platonic constitution to the contest for the prize of merit unless it can first point to some genuine and practical achievement. Up to this time, the notion of bringing it into comparison with the constitutions of Sparta, Rome, and Carthage would be like putting up a statue to compare with living and breathing men, even if such a statue were faultless in point of art, the comparison of the lifeless with the living would naturally leave an impression of imperfection and incongruity upon the minds of the spectators. With the institutions of Lycurgus, I shall therefore omit these and proceed with my description of the Laconian constitution. Now it seems to me that for securing unity among the citizens, for safeguarding the Laconian territory and preserving the liberty of Sparta inviolate, the legislation and provisions of Lycurgus were excellent, that I am forced to regard his wisdom as something superhuman, the equality of landed possessions, the simplicity in their food, and the practice of taking it in common, which he established, were well calculated to secure morality in private life and to prevent civil broilers in the state, as also their training in the endurance of labours and dangers to make men brave and noble-minded. But when both these virtues, courage and high morality, are combined in one soul or in one state, vice will not readily spring from such a soil, nor will such men easily be overcome by their enemies. By constructing his constitution, therefore, in the spirit and of these elements, he secured two blessings to the Spartans, namely for their territory and a lasting freedom for themselves long after he was gone. He appears, however, to have made no one provision whatever, particular or general, for the acquisition of the territory of their neighbours, or for the assertion of their supremacy, or in a word, for any policies of aggrandizement at all. What he had still to do was to impose such a necessity, or create such a spirit among the citizens, that as he had succeeded in making their individual lives independent and simple, the public character of the state should also become independent and moral. But the actual fact is that though he made them the most disinterested and sober-minded men in the world, as far as their own ways of life and their national institutions were concerned, he left them in regard to the rest of Greece ambitious, eager for supremacy and encroaching in the highest degree. So again, drawing the comparison back to Rome, in Sparta, there's this sense of egalitarian equality. We're all Spartans together. We all have skin in the game, and it's important that we focus on the common interests rather than our own private interests.
Right, and he's talking about how. So notice too. I want to highlight this. Back in the beginning, when he talked about Anacyclosis, each of the virtuous forms of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy were brought down by love of money. And one of the things that he and other commentators have pointed to with Sparta was the fact that, at least internally, with Spartan lead coinage, the lead bars, everybody had the same property. This love of money, this avarice, was not encouraged amongst the people at times of peace, but so get into a little bit more in the next section. In times of war and expansion, that wasn't so much the case.
No, that's certainly not. No. Okay. Okay. What we'll do is, because we're starting to get close to the 2-hour mark, I think I'm just going to focus on these particular ones where he's talking about Rome, so we can wrap up. So
you're gonna. I was hoping you'd read the defect of the Spartan constitution.
Okay, I will read that one, and then the rest I'll just stick to the Roman ones. Okay, the defects in the Spartan constitution. For in the first place, is it not notorious that they were nearly the first Greeks to cast a covetous eye upon the territory of their neighbours, and that accordingly they waged a war of subjugation on the Messenians? In the next place, is it not related in all histories that in their dogged obstinacy they bound themselves with an oath never to desist from the siege of Messene until they had taken it? And lastly, it is known to all that in their efforts for supremacy in Greece, they submitted to do the bidding of those whom they had once conquered in war. But when the Persians invaded Greece, they conquered them as champions of the liberty of the Greeks. Yet when the invaders had retired and fled, they betrayed the cities of Greece into their hands by the peace of Anacyclosis. For the sake of getting money to secure their supremacy over the Greeks, it was then that the defect in their constitution was rendered apparent. For as long as their ambition was confined to governing their immediate neighbours, or even the Peloponnesians only, they were content with the resources and supplies provided by Laconia itself, having all material of war ready to hand, and being able, without much expenditure of time, to return home or convey provisions with them. But directly they took in hand to dispatch naval expeditions or to go on campaigns by land outside the Peloponnese, it was evident that neither the iron currency nor their use of crops for payment in kind would be able to supply them with what they lacked in they abided by the legislation of Lycurgus. For such undertakings required money universally current and goods from foreign countries. Thus they were compelled to wait humbly at Persia's doors, impose tribute on the islanders and exact contributions from all the Greeks, knowing that if they abided by the laws of Lycurgus, it was impossible to advance any claims upon any outside power at all, much less upon the supremacy in Greece. So he's essentially saying that the Spartan constitution held the Spartans back.
well, here's what's interesting, right? Because first of all, The peace of Anacyclosis is called the King's Peace in 387, which ended the Corinthian War, which ceded all of the Ionian Greeks back to Persia, which the Athenians had initially built their empire to liberate them. And so this is what many on the right fail to understand, is after the war against Xerxes, Sparta was more than willing to collaborate with Persia and undermine Greek interests abroad. And then second of all, in order to build a fleet to fight Athens and invade Anatolia, like under Agesilaus, you need money. And that forces the state to accumulate money, which, you're not, but they have a whole society which is based on not doing so. But for affairs of state, you have to. And ancient historians viewed Lysander, the Spartan admiral commander, as the one who began to introduce these bad habits. And so now you have a push-pull dynamic. How do you maintain your freedom, your liberty, your constitution, while at the same time expanding? Machiavelli talks about this in the Discourse on Livy. And he argues that you can't. You have to just become a sort of stasis republic like Switzerland, because Rome eventually loses its principles. That happens after Polybius is dead. So they don't actually solve the Spartan problem.
No, certainly not. No. Okay. So Sparta compared with Rome. My object then in this digression is to make it manifest by actual facts that for guarding their own country with absolute safety and for preserving their own freedom, the legislation of Lycurgus was entirely sufficient, and for those who are content with these objects, we must concede that there neither exists nor ever has existed a constitution, civil order preferable to that of Sparta. If anyone is seeking aggrandizement and believes that to be a leader and ruler and despot of numerous subjects, and to have all looking and turning to him is a finer thing than that, in this point of view, we must acknowledge that the Spartan constitution is deficient and that of Rome superior and better constituted for obtaining power. And this has been proved by actual facts. For when the Lacedaemonians strove to possess themselves of the supremacy in Greece, it was not long before they brought their own freedom itself into danger, whereas the Romans, after obtaining supreme power over the Italians themselves, soon brought the whole world under their rule, in which achievement the abundance and availability of their supplies largely contributed to their success. I mean, it's funny, isn't it, that if only Polybius had lived a bit longer, he may have seen this argument be completely undermined by history.
Well, because here's the thing. This is the challenge for any sort of constitutional rule, whether it's Greek or Roman or British or American. At home, you want to have rules and rules-based systems and consensus and checks and balances. In a war, especially in a war of conquest and subjugation, that's the exact opposite. You have to cultivate the exact opposite character traits, the exact opposite legal system, military law separate from civilian law. And so what you end up having is like two parallel societies. One, which is the original constitution, and then the other, which is this sort of like foreign policy hybrid, which deals with the world outside. As we saw with Plutarch writing 400 years after Polybius. The consulship brought down the republic because you had two supreme powers competing, and there was no way to resolve it but by one supreme power conquering the other. And so we see this in the United States as well. A few weeks ago, I read The Conquest of the United States by Spain by William Graham Sumner, published in 1899, saying, look, if we want to have democracy and institutions in the United States, but then occupy the Philippines under military rule, under the guise of giving them democracy, we've undermined our very principles of representative government. And there's another problem, which the libertarians have pointed out, is that beginning in the Philippines, but also in Vietnam and Iraq and other places, the many ex-military become police. And the policing measures in an occupied territory are the militarized police. That's how it is. And they take those principles back to the country of origin, and you create a militarized police force, which is completely inappropriate for this new situation. And so now there's a degrading effect that ultimately undermines the representative institutions. And notice that Sparta's stable and maintains the Lycurgan institutions until the Peloponnesian War, until they need large amounts of money to fight Athens. Then the whole thing unravels.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? We talk about this idea of the Roman consul leading his legions overseas to take territory for Rome, only to come home and then essentially impose a military rule on Rome in the form of the Principate. And when I was reading this, something that came to my mind is, very famously, Voltaire said that, where some states possess an army, the Prussian army possesses a state. Well, in my mind, I think Rome did that before Prussia. Where some states possess an army, the Roman army possesses a state.
Well, yeah. Well, also too, we see this same theme repeated by Sallust, a late, I think, early Roman imperial poet historian, and then Augustine. This is from the City of God, book 2, chapter 18. He says, and he's quoting Sallust. Yet after the destruction of Carthage, discord, avarice, ambition, and the other vices which are commonly generated by prosperity more than ever increased. And this is Augustine, if they increased, and that more than ever, then already they had appeared and had been increasing. And so Sallust adds this reason for what he said, for he says, the oppressive measures of the powerful and the consequent succession of the plebs from the patricians and other dissensions had existed from the first, and affairs were administered with equity and well-tempered justice for no longer period than the short time after the expulsion of the kings, while the city was occupied with the serious Tuscan war, Tarquin's vengeance. But from Sallust's point of view, it's victory in war, all the money flooding into Italy, all the slaves, and now you kind of have this like glut, and now the Romans go on a spree. And again, that's the price of empire, right? The same with Caesar and Pompey. They bring back treasures. That also puts Rome on a spree. And then ultimately all those institutions just kind of fall away. I mean, I guess if we want to bring in Carlyle again, it's the cash nexus. It creates a cash nexus where everything that you do in political life is mediated through cash exchange. And when that happens, it's almost like a planetary orbit shift where your original constitution, you might even still think you believe in it, but the sort of mediation that takes place has sort of turned it on its head completely.
No, certainly. Okay, so what I want to finish up with is let's do Carthage compared with Rome next, because I found this one fascinating. Now, the Carthaginian constitution seems to me originally to have been well contrived in these most distinctively important particulars. For they had kings, and the Gerousia had the powers of an aristocracy, and the multitude were supreme in such things as affected them. And on the whole, the adjustment of its several parts was very like that of Rome and Sparta, but about the period of its entering on the Hannibalian War, the political state of Carthage was on the decline, that of Rome improving. For whereas there was in every body or polity or business a natural state of growth, zenith, and decay, and whereas everything in them is at its best at the zenith, we may thereby judge of the difference between these two constitutions as they existed at that period. For exactly so far as the strength and prosperity of Carthage preceded that of Rome in point of time, by so much was Carthage then past its prime, while Rome was exactly at its zenith, as far as its political constitution was concerned. In Carthage, therefore, the influence of the people in the policy of the state had already risen to the supreme, while at Rome the Senate was at the height of its power, and so as in the one measures were deliberated upon by the many, and the other by the best men, the policy of the Romans in all public undertakings proved the stronger, on which the count, although they met with capital disasters, by force of prudent counsels they finally conquered the Carthaginians in the war. Now, it's very interesting that Polybius seems to be arguing that, going back to the Anacyclosis model, that Carthage seems to be in some form of like mob rule, essentially, which is, so therefore it's much further down the stage of Anacyclosis, which is why Rome trashed it. I don't know if I quite agree. I'm not an expert on the Carthaginian political system, but from my understanding, it was quite oligarchic. And from my understanding, with the Second Punic War, one of the reasons why Hannibal ultimately failed is that he was unable to get the backing of these powerful families back in Carthage that were sort of running the Gerousia. So if anything, it seems more of an oligarchy that's generated from an aristocracy than a mob rule, if anything.
I would agree. I don't think it evolved to that stage yet. The other thing that's interesting that he's not really commenting on here, because of that division between Hannibal and the Senate, Spain ultimately becomes a third quasi-independent power center due to Hamilcar's conquests in the 230s. And so by the time Hannibal takes power, there had been a previous governor, his brother, Hanno, and it looked like they were trying to build a Hellenistic monarchy in Spain. So it actually, Hannibal represented not even the oligarchic element, but a new rising Hellenistic monarchy, like what you would have found on the other end of the Mediterranean. Some of this is based on coinage, where Hannibal and his brother, the prior governor, his brother Hanno, are minting coins in the style of Hellenistic monarchs. So in that case, Hannibal might have represented the restarting of Anacyclosis because he represents a monarchical figure.
Well, what's interesting is you've got this idea of the Barcid family establishing a kingdom in Iberia, but it's not that similar to Caesar in Gaul, isn't it? Because he used Gaul as a springboard to then conquer the rest of the Roman world. So,
Yes.
well, imagine if Hannibal had won the Second Punic War and defeated Rome, he could have eventually, with this kingdom in Spain, then launched a campaign and took over Carthage itself, which is that's quite fascinating to think about, actually.
Maybe he should have done that first.
Perhaps. And then maybe once he'd done that, then maybe he could have defeated Rome.
Well, I mean, yeah. I think we're both in agreement, right? He just didn't get the funding from Carthage to actually deal the knockout blow.
No, I can't help but that phrase from Sun Tzu comes to mind. And was it defeated warriors go to war and then seek to win, while victorious warriors seek to win and then go to war? Or is it the other way around?
I don't remember.
Yeah, but yeah, that's essentially what happens there. Okay, right. Okay, yeah. Let's finish up with this last one. Conclusion: dangers ahead for Rome. That to all things then which exist there is ordained decay and change, I think requires no further arguments to show, for the inexorable course of nature is sufficient to convince us of it. But in all polities we observe two sources of decay existing from natural causes, the one external, the other internal and self-produced. The external admits of no certain order or fixed admits of no certain or fixed definition, but the internal follows a definite order. What kind of polity then comes naturally first, and from what that second, I've already stated in such a way that those who are capable of taking in the whole drift of my argument can henceforth draw their own conclusions as to the future of the Roman polity. But it's quite clear, in my opinion, when a commonwealth, after warding off many great dangers, has arrived at a high pitch of prosperity and undisputed power, it is evident that by the lengthened continuance of great wealth within it, the manner of life of its citizens will become more extravagant, and that the rivalry for office and in other spheres of activity will become fiercer than it ought to be. And as this state of things goes on more and more, the desire of office and the shame of losing reputation, as well as the ostentation and extravagance of living, will prove the beginning of a deterioration. And of this change, the people will be credited with being the authors when they become convinced that they are being cheated by some from avarice, and are puffed up with flattery by others from love of office. For when that comes about in their passionate resentment and acting under the dictates of anger, they will refuse to obey any longer or to be content with having equal powers with their leaders, but will demand to have all or far the greatest themselves. And when that comes to pass, the constitution will receive a new name, which sounds better than any other in the world, liberty or democracy, but in fact it will become the worst of all governments, mob rule. With this description of the formation, growth, zenith, and present state of the Roman polity, and having discussed also its difference, for better or worse, from other polities, I'll now at length bring my essay on it to an end. So, ultimately, Rome's at the zenith of its power, but this is the danger zone, as he set out with Carthage. From the zenith, things can only potentially get worse, and that would be the steering towards mob rule, because the current republican system of Rome at that time was clearly aristocratic and, dare I say, veering onto oligarchic. And so, though ultimately Polybius believed Rome would be able to buck the trend, his warning here of what could happen ultimately was more accurate.
Yeah, and it was the increase, and in later Romans who commented back on the 2nd century BC pointed out that this increase in wealth is what perverted and corrupted the Roman institutions themselves, right? So even before Roman generals would have the gall to march on Rome proper, there had to be a long fall already for that to happen.
Oh, no, certainly. And well, any final comments you want to make before we wrap up?
I would say that I generally like Polybius's work. I read a bunch of his history for an earlier series of shows I was doing with terminal philosophy on ancient warfare, but I feel like he has, this section here has some really good parts, the different cycles of government, the technical description of the Roman and Spartan constitutions, but like he strikes me as unusually opinionated, like about Thebes and Athens. And I would agree, I don't think Carthage had fallen to mob rule at the time, but was still an oligarchy. So there seems to be he's not as consistent. Well, I think part of it, he even says in the preface to this section, I'm just going to have a digression because I want to. It's sort of a passion project, which is inserted into the book, which is fun. I'm not saying I wish he didn't do it, but I think there's like a different level of accuracy. It's not quite as, I think, accurate as like the first 5 books.
One thing I'll say is I think there's a tendency that any great thinker whose great theory or model, they try to shape everything to fit their model, and I think that's what he's possibly falling foul of here a bit.
That could be true too.
Because another historian I'm very familiar with, Arnold Toynbee, he very much was influenced by Polybius, and the study of history is a great work, but there's certainly times where he's really trying to shape things to fit his model. And I'll leave it at that. That's a massive digression.
Sure.
Okay, we've had a few comments more from Michael Hasler, which I think we could read through. So, would a modern American Caesar rise and our close? Also, praise the folly. Have you read Ivan Ilyin?
So I've not read Ivan Ilyin, and I don't really think an American Caesar. Okay, if by an American Caesar you mean a military dictator like Julius Caesar or Cromwell or Franco, no. I think because we live in the cash nexus, we don't have those kinds of bonds of loyalty that would facilitate a military coup. Whereas in the United States, I think what we're more likely to have is some sort of what we're seeing now, corporate takeover, if you will. I mean, Musk and both parties, of course, have corporate donors and backers, but they've been coming out of the woodwork lately, right? In the 2020 election. No, sorry, 2016, right? Because it was Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang. Bloomberg came out to run. Oh, just this rich banker dude, but I'm going to run, guys, because I'm a rich banker dude. And then you've got, Elon Musk, who's coming out. The new leader is going to be some sort of like oligarch who I think will just, we kind of already know they run the show. They'll just stop trying to hide it.
It was interesting because did you read the article I put up with the Old Glory Club, the new managerialism?
No, I didn't even see that.
Oh, no, that's fine. No, I talk about this. Essentially, I draw comparisons between the PayPal Mafia and the Milner Group. If you're familiar with that at all, or
the British Secret Society,
yeah, because so again, I very much see the PayPal Mafia behind Trump as essentially this kind of they're replacing the idiocracy, the idiocracy of the Democrats with a technocracy of the PayPal Mafia.
Yes.
Or perhaps even, dare I say, the gerontocracy of the Uniparty.
Well, that too, right?
Yeah, certainly. And more comments from Michael Hasler. So, how would a modern American Caesar dismantle the money lobbying if he can't use the military because the military does not work like it did back then? Then it's not social bonds. Oh, so you've responded to that, haven't you?
Oh, you know what? He must have asked 2 questions because he must have been referring to what I was saying earlier in the talk. Well, if you wanted to dismantle the money power, what a sort of political actor would do is he would, instead of sending troops out to arrest people or execute them like Sulla or Caesar or Cromwell or Franco, what I think you would see, which we haven't seen yet actually, is a kind of mass labor movement. This if you wanted to speak in terms of Caesar without using military force, you'd have some sort of like revolutionary figure who pushes for like mass labor organizing and seeks to just grind the entire system to a halt through a series of economic actions and strikes.
No, that's certainly interesting. And one last comment. By the way, have you read or heard the Power Elite book by C. Wright Mills?
I have heard of it, but I have not read it.
Yeah, I know AA used it, I think, for research of populist delusion, and that's my extent of my knowledge of that book. So, yeah, I've never read it. Well, thank you again for coming on, Todd. Is there anything you would like to shill before we get out of here?
Well, yeah. Tomorrow, my channel, I'll be doing a show on an episode on my channel why I think the sort of political conception of autocracy within the Western concept is itself alien to the true spirit of the West.
Well, interesting. Everybody go give Todd a watch. in terms of this channel, next Tuesday we should be returning to the normal day for archival discourses. I think I'm going to be reading through some Ibn Khaldun and his concept of Asabaya. Continue this theme of cycles of history. So, and I'll obviously work on other stuff in the background. And if you want to support my work, please join the channel and become a member. You get access to many past streams that are behind the paywall. And let me just make sure I've not had any super chats. No super chats. Okay, well, thank you everybody for watching, and good night.
Good night.